welcome to the IdeaCast interview series, episode 38. My guest in this episode is Dr. Jennifer Frazer, and Dr. Frazer received her PhD in Comparative Literature at the University of Toronto. And Dr. Frazer is an award-winning teacher who has taught at university, college, and high school level. And in this episode, we discuss her latest book called The Bullied Brain, Heal Your Scars and Restore Your Health. And I would say the first 20 to 30 minutes of this conversation, we do a thumbnail sketch of the book and the premise, and then the conversation moves into more of a dialogue where we discuss the contents of the book as well as some of the issues that orbit around the contents of the book. And so if you've dealt with abuse or worse in your life, or bullying, this might be a good conversation to tune into. If you deal with depression, anxiety, or you're not quite sure if something you experienced in your past was abuse, this book is a great tool and a great resource for you to sort through some of this. So I invite you to join us in this conversation. We both felt as though it was a wonderful conversation at the end, and I hope you feel the same way when you finish this. And we thank you very much for joining us in this conversation, and please enjoy. I'd like to welcome Dr. Jennifer Frazer to the IdeaCast interview series. I'm happy to have her on board, and I'm excited for this conversation. And I will say to the audience, to the YouTube folks that are watching, that this is going to be at once riveting and interesting subject matter, and it's also going to be things that I think are under-addressed in the public sphere, in the community of humanity. So brace yourselves, it's going to be a great conversation, and welcome, Dr. Frazer.
Thank you so much for having me, Justin. It's wonderful to be here. I love to talk about this.
Yeah, and I do too, because I, having read your book, and I just finished it yesterday, I'm sold, and I am, and I'm also someone who was ticking the boxes. I was like, yeah. I was going through my own biography, and I was like, yeah, I had learning disabilities. I had an abusive parent that was, an abused child, and so, it was a trip down memory lane for me. And I say that because I have an Irish sense of humor, and it was not funny and it was not good. But at my age, I am, at peace with most everything that's ever occurred in my life. So to the YouTube audience, I would like to say that the Bullied Brain is a tool that you can put in your toolbox if you've begun the journey of self-inquiry and self-exploration, transformation. If in your life you've dealt with anxiety and depression, and you're not quite sure if you are to blame for how you express yourself in life, and if you're not quite sure what happened to you as a child or a teenager, and there's confusion, and that confusion is in a circuitous hamster wheel of negative valence, which is just, you're not feeling the joie de vivre, you're not feeling the spontaneity of life. And I know that sounds a little grandiose, but I really, this book has touched me in a sense that it really drills down and gets into the meat of, frankly, matters that have not been adequately addressed and covered. And it goes across culture. I don't think it's an American thing or a Western Hemisphere thing or a first world thing. I think, and Jennifer can talk to me about this as well, but I think it's universal in humanity, save for Neolithic cultures that are still tribal and still living the way we did 20,000 years ago. They probably don't have these kind of problems, I hope, anyway. Anyway, I just want to drive home the point that this is an excellent place to further your inquiry, launch an inquiry into the nature of suffering in your life, the nature of not feeling whole in your life. And I'll leave it at that. And so, Jennifer, if you could pick up on that, and just if you could maybe start with an elevator pitch of what this book is, and then go into the provenance of how this book came to be.
Well, the way I think about the book, if I have to sort of collapse it all the way down into a single phrase, like the film industry uses taglines to be able to just in one moment. What is the essential concept? And the essential concept of the book is that hurt brains hurt. And so if I have a hurt brain, I'm suffering. To go back to what you were describing, I might be suffering in the form of anxiety or depression. I might have something, even a mental illness like a bipolar diagnosis, or a disordered eating situation, or substance abuse. And we tend in society to treat these things as if they are a moral failing, really. We act as though, if someone's a drug addict, or if somebody has a mental illness, there's a stigma attached to it. Still in our society in the 21st century, which is really surprising, because we have extensive science that tells us that hurt brains hurt. And the key word in that sentence that our society doesn't spend enough time on, I think, is brains. So my book is about what happens to brains when they get hurt. And so this is what I started to look at: bullying and abuse in all its different forms. And what I discovered that's so fascinating is, in our society, we privilege the body. And it's because we're very, very simple creatures on one level. We're incredibly visual. So, if you take your dog for a walk, it can be a kind of irritating experience, because your dog has to smell every single thing. And we don't smell things for the most part as humans. That's not how we create our reality. We create our reality with what we see. And we believe what we see. So our biggest tragedy in many senses is that we cannot see our brains. And so we ignore them. So in my book, The Bullied Brain, I'm literally talking about every single one of us that doesn't daily spend time with our brains. If we're ignoring our brains, we're doing one of the worst bullying tactics out there, which is to give the message that someone or something is not worthy of your attention.
And I believe this might have been a phrase that you coined yourself, and it's the bully paradigm. And it seems to be a normative or a community standard almost to go with the flow of this type of behavior and this type of repetitive behavior, and all the memetics that go with it, all the support and enabling that goes with it. And it's overwhelming when you really start to pull back the layers of our culture. And this now I will narrow down specifically into Western culture, which I'm familiar with. So I look at entertainment, I look at interactions with others, and even fictional literature, just going on and on and on, and how it's so imbued in how we behave. And how did we get here? How did we arrive where this is a normative, the bullying paradigm?
Well, what's really interesting to me is, when I was graduating and doing a BA, and this was at University of British Columbia in the 1980s, I was doing an honors English degree. So I had to write an original essay of 50 pages, which, when you're 22 is pretty daunting. I was really quite amazed by it. And I ended up writing about, I studied the play, Shakespeare's play King Lear, and I looked at the bullying relationship, the abusive relationship between the father and his three daughters. And then I looked at how the three daughters retaliated against the father, not Cordelia, but the other two daughters, against the father when he became elderly and powerless. And it was the first time that I really, as a young person, was looking at the dynamic of bullying and abuse and its relationship to power. So one of the most fascinating neuroscience pieces that I learned about in doing the research for The Bullied Brain was that power and empathy are in an inverse ratio. So the more powerful you become, the less empathy you have, which is, and to remind everyone, empathy, we tend to mix it up with sympathy. So it's Brene Brown's thing where she always is quick to set us straight. The idea that sympathy is a little bit condescending. You feel sorry for the person, like a bad thing happened to them, or they did a bad thing, and you really feel sorry for them. And so you put yourself on a higher level, kind of looking down on them. In contrast, empathy is when you deeply, on intellectual level, on a feeling level, on a spiritual level, you feel and connect with what the person feels. You walk in their shoes. And so can you imagine if you if you are spending all your time, and our culture encourages and gives you much honor and wealth and prestige if you have power. So we drive ourselves to obtain this kind of power without a really clear sense that in the brain, it's eroding our empathy. And this is where we make terrible mistakes as leaders.
And I've always, as a part-time student of Western history, I've always looked to how the feudal system in the Middle Ages and the Dark Ages has sort of converted over into what became the Age of Commerce and sort of the Age of Enlightenment, and the concomitant rise of economics and scientific advancement, and how the nature of our drive for that kind of well-being, the financial well-being and well-being through capital. And I'm not criticizing, I'm a small business owner, have been my whole life, so I'm not going down a Marxist path here necessarily. It's just that I see that what you say, the fetishization of power has been part of our system, I believe, our ethics and our, again, normatives of behavior, which I guess correlates with the allowance for this type of insensitivity, if you will, or looking the other way when it comes to misuse of power. Because there's obviously different types of power. There's power that's shared, and we see that in collectivist kind of societies. And I referenced Neolithic culture earlier, and I've taken a huge deep dive down the rabbit hole on the existing tribal cultures in our world today, as well as paleoanthropological observation of how we sort of came up as people in the last couple 100,000 years. And it is that sort of collectivist mentality where there are the village elders, there is maybe a tribal chieftain or whatever, but he does not abuse that power, or she does not abuse that power, that it is a distributed power amongst the people in the community, 25, 30 people, extended family. And they do that for a reason. They do that for not only surviving, but successful surviving. And on top of that, perhaps even well-being and all these other things that might come from it. So I'm on a tangent, but I see that we took a specific turn probably in the 17th century or thereabouts when we started becoming more technologically advanced. And I think along with that, there was that spirit of adventure that was the new mercantilism and all this wealth being generated in Europe, and to the expense of others, of course. But that might be the part of the seed, I think, of this fetishism of power. I always get stuck on that fetishization of power.
Yeah, that is not
right?
An easy word to say.
Right, and the linearity of power. So you have this sort of pyramidal structure of power, and we tend to fetishize that. We tend to worship that, and it shows up in the market and enterprise, and it shows up in the state as well, you know.
Well, in the Bullied Brain, what I really looked at, and I use that word very carefully, bullied brain, because as I said before, I'm looking at how we bully our own brains by ignoring them. But I also am looking at the greatest power imbalance. And as you and I have discussed, it's something that makes people very uncomfortable. They don't like to talk about it. But the greatest power imbalance that exists, and the one that has the most importance attached to it for individuals and for society and the planet as a whole, is the relationship between an adult and a child. So adults have exponential amounts of power over children. And that is really why it must be a sacred trust. And it must be sacred in the sense of being deeply informed. You really shouldn't have power over children unless you have a lot of knowledge and wisdom about what is best for the child. And what I learned in researching the book is we are operating in an absolutely outdated, I hate to use the word, but we are operating in a backwards way with children. And we're doing incredible amounts of damage to our children. And I know that's hard to hear, and it's even painful to hear, but it is a fact. And it can be looked at statistically, it can be looked at scientifically, it can be looked at objectively, and we can't pretend anymore that with all our resources and all our advancement and all our technology, that we are doing healthy things with child and youth populations, because we're not. And that's what the book is about. The book is about empowering people essentially to rebel and revolt against a broken down, very destructive belief system.
And I think you hit the nail on the head when you were talking about the gold to lead conversion, the alchemist's inversion. When you talk about the richness and potential in a child, and in almost a tabula rasa sense, that the child is there to be molded and to be formed, and for various reasons that process doesn't necessarily go the way it should. And I put judgment on that because part of a child's learning is introjection with the parent, with the people around it, and it's also learning its environment, the static environment. And there's a cost benefit in that, I think. And I'm not speaking like I know anything, but I just, from my own experience and from watching other people, anecdotally, I can say that there is this terrible price to be paid for being that big sponge that takes in all the information of the world, trusts, as you said, the authorities, the grand authorities that are our parents and those in our orbits. And that's where things can go awry. But I do love that gold to lead analogy that happens way more than it should, I think.
Well, that I can't take credit for the analogy. It's actually from Dr. Vincent Felitti.
Okay.
And it's one of the most important, I mean, if you take anything away from this conversation, your listeners, I hope they take this away. And that is that in the 1990s, two American doctors, Dr. Vincent Felitti and Dr. Robert Anda, did an incredibly important study. They interviewed and worked with close to 20,000 patients. And what they were trying to figure out, the question that they had set themselves was, is there a relationship between childhood and childhood adversity or suffering or abuse, very specifically at the hands of adults, not the kind of trauma that you get from immigration or from a war or a natural disaster. They didn't look at any of that. They had 10 very specific questions, and it had to do with how adults affected the child. 5 of the questions were things like, did you have a parent or family member in jail, or substance abuse problems, a mental health issue, those kinds of issues. But 5 of the questions were you abused? Mm-hmm. Were you abused physically as a child? Were you abused mentally as a child by, put downs and berating and humiliation and, or being ignored as a child, neglected emotionally, not loved, not cared for, not seen, not responded to, physically neglected, or sexually abused? So those 5 questions was what I was looking at very specifically, because I was interested in what does all forms of bullying and abuse do to brains, and specifically vulnerable brains, like the brains of children that are developing very rapidly. And this is a part of our backward system. Vast majority of people don't know that the 13 to 25-year-old brain is arguably the most vulnerable. These teens and 20-somethings might look like adults, but they're not. Their brains are undergoing rapid development that puts them at risk. And adults have to treat them with kid gloves to a certain degree in order to support and care for them until the moment that they actually do become an adult at 24, 25 from a brain perspective. So what Dr. Felitti said was that what was so heartbreaking for them was to find out that these children born with golden potential were so brutally abused and so rampantly abused in their homes that it spoiled them. They found that in midlife, they became lead. They had chronic health disease of unbelievable levels. They were having heart attacks and strokes. They had obesity issues. They had substance abuse issues. Their health, they had arthritis, they had diabetes. They shouldn't have ever been in that place, but due to abuse, and you couldn't see it. They looked like normal, healthy, functioning human beings, but on a brain level, their brains are damaged, and they go into life believing that, the abuse, was the making of me. It toughened me up. It gave me grit. I'm so resilient. I'm tough. I can do really bad things to other people now as well. This crazy, infectious, intergenerational cycle is just heartbreaking. And so in the book, in The Bullied Brain, what I tried to do was say, look, this is a medical problem. we have to stop being so moralizing and judging about it. It's not bad people and good people. So one of the statistics, as you would know, Justin, because you've read the book, but one of the things that I share at the very beginning of the book to hit home with this issue is just this one fact alone should make it really clear for everybody that there is no judgment. There's no blaming and shaming to happen. Yes, we have to hold people incredibly accountable. Adults have to be held totally transparently accountable for what they do to kids, especially. There's no doubt about that. And they should never be in a position where they can re-victimize if they're identified as abusive and they haven't been rehabilitated. But what I am saying is 70% of inmates in the California prison system were in foster care. In other words, hurt brains hurt. They get aggressive. They get violent. They break rules. They get desperate for self-medication. They turn to anything that will calm them and soothe them and numb their pain, like alcohol or illicit drugs or prescription drugs. They are unwell. They are medically unwell. It can be seen on brain scans that their brains are damaged. So why we keep operating in society like the brain is irrelevant, we don't need to know about our brains, we don't need to get our brains checked, doctors don't look at our brains, until something's gone totally haywire, like dementia, nobody's even looking at our brains. Our teeth are looked at twice a year, but not our brains.
Right, because brain across the board, I think most people correlate brain with mind, which is an abstraction, and then mind is so vague and nebulous, and we're on autopilot most of the time. Everything is sort of a default process except for the emotional outbursts that we might have, but everything else is just sort of grinding through our lives. And so it makes sense that we can't necessarily, you can see an amputation, you can see a tumor growing, but like you said, the interiority of the brain, which most would again say is the storehouse of the mind, or some might even say the generator of the mind, but we could get into a philosophical. I love talking to philosophers about philosophy of mind, so I'll shut up. I'm not going to go that way. But brain mind correlation, and it's just, again, it's so it's almost obtuse. It's almost like there's just no way to really unpack that in a palatable way, in a means that's available for the country, the population at large, I guess we'll say that. And that's hard. That's just really hard. And that's something I've been thinking about, and having read your book, I've spent maybe the last 7 or 8 days, chapter at a time, and then thinking on the book. And it's like, God, where do you start with this? Where do you even begin with going from a bullying paradigm to more of a paradigm of awareness and empathy and action? And as we were just talking about children, they are the greatest, most precious resource and the greatest commodity we can have for a brighter future for ourselves. And as you said, it gets spoiled by no fault. And that's what I love about your book, is you don't lay blame at the feet of people who are themselves injured. So there is a non-judgmentality, and yes, strong caveat has to be applied to that if you've crossed a particular line and violations have occurred that need to be dealt with by the justice system, then that needs to be addressed. But if there are people who are, let's say, in that middle zone of abuse, and they can be rehabilitated, that is just as critical as not ruining our children as we bring them up. And so going back to where do you even begin, and how do you even crack the shell of our current culture? We're good at messaging, we're good at info. We have the internet now, we have social media, we have all these things, but really, how does that messaging campaign even look attractive? How does it have salience? How does it have resonance? All these things have to be considered. And again, that's one of the things I love about your book, is you're beginning this conversation. You're beginning you're inviting people to think about it, to think about what does a future look like that is absent, or to a lesser degree, of this paradigmatic bully nature that we're currently dealing with. And yeah, I don't have the mind for that to throw out a real good silver bullet kind of thing. But it starts with these conversations, I guess, and discovery. Again.
Well, I spend a lot of time. I mean, it's something that you do as a writer and something you do as a teacher, is you try to find a way to communicate the information so that it's something that a person can get, that it makes sense, and they can, so you're always looking for an analogy. What is the comparison so that the person can go, oh yeah, that makes sense. And so what I found myself using, I did a TEDx talk, and I called it the Neuroscience of Bullying, but they changed the title because I think the title just freaked everybody out. And they called it something like, does childhood bullying have long-term impacts or something? But what I used as the analogy was the idea that sort of when I was growing up as a child, it was completely normal to smoke cigarettes. I'm older than you, but back in the day, everybody smoked. Like your parents smoked, your grandparents smoked, your teachers smoked, professors smoked. You'd go to the doctor and he'd write your prescription with the cigarette in one hand. It was normal. It was totally normal. So then all of a sudden, this revolutionary thing happened where they started to be able to see tumors and cancer beginning in lungs and blackening lungs. And we could all, being very visual creatures, as we talked about before, we could all see the images of this cancerous development happening because of technology. So the X-ray was what allowed us to, see something that we couldn't understand previous to that. So we had a belief system around smoking. We believed that it made us tough. We believed it made us glamorous. We'd be like Audrey Hepburn if we smoked. We thought it was a great health technique because it kept your weight down. I mean, completely erroneous, crazy notions. But we were steeped in it. We grew up in it. And so we believed that system. I argue in the Bullied Brain that we have done the same thing with bullying and abuse. We believe that it's necessary for greatness. And one of the best Hollywood dissections of this, as you know from reading the book, Justin, is Whiplash. I highly recommend anyone who wants to understand abuse, like the real way in which abuse works in our culture, take 2 hours and watch Whiplash. Because what Damien Chazelle is doing, and he was a teenager that had an abuser like that, a psychological, emotional abuser. And he talks about how incredibly damaging it was. And he suffered himself depression and anxiety. But what he unpacks in the movie, which is so brilliant, is that a lot of people are trained to believe that abuse makes you strong. It makes you great. It makes you talented. This is why we have to abuse gymnasts. These girls need to be destroyed in order to perform and win medals for countries. We have to destroy our child musicians and actors and on and on and on, our academics, whatever it is that we believe. So what I really wanted to do in the book is debunk that myth, because it is a myth. There's not a single piece of research that backs it up. There's not a single scientist, no psychologist, no philosopher that will put their name to arguing that by abusing a child, you are unleashing their potential. No one. On the flip side, there's the most massive amount of research that shows that all forms of bullying and abuse damage brains. So I leave, I want to pause for a moment so everyone can listen to my dog drinking water. Can everyone hear that?
I can hear the lapping.
Yeah, sorry about that, everybody. That is a very large standard poodle who has no respect for Zoom or YouTube or conversations about the brain. So it's a little distracting for me, but what I wanted to say was,
but if I could just jump in, it's a gift because we have an instinctual animal who is not sort of preoccupied with any types of formalities. Your poodle is living in the moment. It is probably very stress-free. So we'll pin that right now. And when we get into some of the solution-oriented talk later, that dog is a Zen master. And so I honor your pooch. But anyway, let's go back to.
No, it's totally true. And it's a good segue. Now she's shaking herself. It's a good segue from talking about what I call the bullying and abuse paradigm. So we have been, and this is why you can't blame and shame people for abusing, because the bottom line is it's like blaming and shaming someone for smoking. If your brain has been raised in an environment that is hammered into you to normalize something, whether it's smoking, back in the 80s, nobody did any exercise. We all thought that you didn't need to jog or go to aerobics or do any form of exercise at all, and you'd be just fine. Well, then the fitness revolution happened. I think we're at a turning point, a very exciting, very empowering turning point, where the people, for example, if they began even with the Bullied Brain, they would learn that they can do very practical, very inexpensive, very healthy, empowering things for their own brain. They can heal damage done. They can protect themselves against toxic stress. There are so many things you can do when you start to work with your brain and not against it. And I call that, and it's what I hope happens in the world, I call that the new neuro paradigm. The idea that we foreground our brain health. When we talk to one another, we respect one another's brains. We think about all the knowledge we have and all the research that shows that if you put me down or started yelling at me, it would really hurt my brain. You wouldn't be able to see it and I wouldn't, but we could see it on a brain scan. And that needs to be the start of how we treat each other.
Yeah, for sure. And for those watching, we are going to get into the parts of the book where Jennifer covers solutions and techniques and modalities that can be put to use. And they, as she states in the book, it requires some discipline, and it requires delayed gratification expectations and a number of other things. But if you really are here watching this video because I've been there, we've hit walls and we've had those dark nights of the soul, as it were. And so if you're in that mode, we're going to cover that and we're going to talk about that. And it's, to me, it's just, if we want to talk about ways to bring society and humanity to a point of healthy resiliency and healthy flourishing, authentic flourishing, then just what is being discussed in your book with regard to science or evidence-based approaches and practices to begin that journey of recovery, of rehabilitation, and acceptance for who you are as a creature that can change, a person. And it gets more difficult as we get older. I'm in my 50s, and so I know that it's it's not easy when you're, say, and sometimes the target age is like 35. That a lot of stuff is kind of set in stone, but I don't really believe that. I think we can be malleable up to a much greater age. Anyway, would it be good at this point to stop for a moment for those watching, if you could lay out, we could do a glossary of terms here, and we'll start with the simplest of terms, like let's define abuse and bullying, and let's define what the damage to the brain is without having to go too detailed. But can we start with what is a kind of across the board definition of abuse and bullying, if that's not asking too big a question?
No, it's really important. I want to circle back to one thing that you said, though, Justin. One of the most important discoveries that I want to share with people in the book is the work of Dr. Michael Merzenich. And Dr. Michael Merzenich, if you don't know him, he is one of the world's greatest living neuroscientists. And he won the Kavli Prize, which is the Nobel Prize in Norway for neuroscience, in 2016. And he's basically just an outright genius. At the same time as being an outright neuroscientific genius, he's a passionate human being for change and health. And he studied in his lab for 40 years ways in which the brain can heal. And he has learned, and he's called by his colleagues the father of neuroplasticity. So I think the first word we should start with in our glossary is neuroplasticity. And what Dr. Michael Merzenich showed and proved is, along with colleagues, but he was an absolute leader in the field, is that our brains can change right until the very last day we have on the planet. They are not locked in. They are not set in stone. They're not hardwired. They are soft wired. And that's why he calls his book Soft Wired. Because what we need to know is it is a choice what our brain is like, just like our physical bodies. If we want to exercise and we want to work out and we want to push ourselves and stress our bodies with healthy things like, bicycling and skating and swimming, all of those things make us incredibly healthy and resilient and flexible. And that's what we need to do with our brains. Once again, we tend to ignore our brains and we ignore their need for fitness simply because we don't see them. But just as much as the body, the brain needs to work out. It needs fitness. It needs exercise. So the more people think, the more empathy they have, the more they feel, the more they challenge themselves, the more they take it to the next level and learn another language, the more they read philosophy and do mathematics and every other thing. It's really important for brain health. But Dr. Merzenich, being the sort of person he has developed with his colleagues an online, it's a gamified way of actually doing brain training. And it has an enormous amount of neuroscientific research behind it. And it's a half an hour a day, and it costs less than Netflix. And every single person can go onto their computer who has it and Wi-Fi and just do half an hour of brain training. Like, it would change the whole world if all of our children were doing this, our teenagers, our young people, our elderly people. It's been shown to minimize your risk to get Alzheimer's and dementia. But I can't tell you how hard it is to get this information into the hands of people who need it. It's almost like, Lord knows these days we don't want to even use the word conspiracy, but you feel sometimes on dark days or dark nights of the soul as if there's almost a conspiracy to stop people from getting this incredibly important knowledge. So our word number one is neuroplasticity. It means your brain's capacity to change based on your practices as well as your environment. If you're in a toxic environment, it's hurting your brain because you have neuroplasticity. And so when we were talking about the adolescent brain, they have incredibly intense neuroplasticity, just as you were pointing out, Justin, up to the age of 25. And then it gets a little more stable, but you can still change your brain. So going to the second idea, that the words we use for bullying and abuse. What I do is I define bullying as a kind of an umbrella term, because what I found in doing the research is that if you just start with microaggressions in an organization or a school or a home, if microaggressions like making jokes that are actually a little bit hurtful, or being sarcastic all the time, or rolling your eyes, or not paying attention, like, you could argue parents whose faces are glued to their phones, that's a microaggression to a child's developing brain. I mean, the parent doesn't mean it as a destructive thing, but it's really, really harmful that they're not looking at their baby's face. They're not looking at the toddler. They're not talking to them. They're not connecting with them. They're like this in front of a device. Well, that's a microaggression. And you can take the microaggression all the way up to very extreme violations of the human body, beating someone up or raping someone or doing something that really does quite significant harm to the body. When I talk about bullying and abuse, I cover the whole spectrum, and I talk about how interrelated they are. If you have an organization that looks the other way for microaggressions, you're creating the conditions for abuse to start to get normalized. And so really what we need to do if we want to change society is, we don't want to have a school where all the teachers are amazing. 99% of the teachers are completely empathic and caring, and they put the kids first, and they don't have psychological issues, but you've got 2 or 3 or maybe 4 teachers who are incredibly abusive, because the child's brain anticipating the abuse that they're going to go through in period 5 of a day is very destructive. It dismantles brain architecture. So yeah, one of the things that I find backwards in our society is, and you can even see this in the law, we privilege the body. So if you grew up in a household where you were emotionally degraded day in, day out by your parent, but they never they never hit you, that's an equivalent amount of damage, according to the scales of Vincent Felitti and Robert Anda, as physical or sexual abuse. Because the reason is, all forms of abuse, regardless of what the relationship is to the body or how the body is impacted, all forms of abuse damage the brain. And emotional abuse, psychological abuse, or psychological neglect also damages the body, in that it causes, it's too complicated to get into in a conversation, but it's documented in the book. It causes the immune system to get completely thrown out of whack, because the body no longer is activating a stress response and then taking it away. because the predator is gone. The body and the brain are in a constant state of hypervigilance because they're always anticipating the next onslaught of the humiliation or the berating or the yelling in the face, or then go on to physical or sexual abuse. So, I mean, when I talk about bullying and abuse, I really focus on adults to children, and I look in detail at all the ways that adults bully and abuse children, and sometimes really don't even understand that that's what they're doing. They change the language when it comes to adults. They say, oh no, it's discipline, what I'm doing. I'm hitting a child with a blunt instrument, it's discipline. Really? Because that's bullying when a child does it to another child. Oh, when I'm yelling in a kid's face and publicly humiliating and shaming them in front of their peers, that's motivation. It's like, really? Because on the playground or in the locker lined hallway, that would be called bullying. So why do we change the language when it comes to adults? And these are the sorts of things I try to unpack in the book, because I think we got to shake ourselves out of this mental stupor we're in.
Yeah, absolutely. And that ties back into what you were saying earlier, where peer-to-peer bullying is not authority to subordinate bullying. It is, it's attempting that, but it's also still peer-to-peer. Whereas chronologically, you have a 35-year-old who's walloping a 10-year-old or whatever. And it is interesting to note that that is something that, again, by normatives is considered standard or acceptable to some degree, perhaps. Maybe some people might, oh, well, that's a bit excessive. You could have just berated him verbally in front of his peers, yeah, or her, and, you know. But still, it's within that wheelhouse of, or within the structure of the bullying paradigm. So going to the damage of the brain that occurs, I think there's probably a few simple things we could touch on, where in your book you mention how cortisol levels increase, and there's physiological things that change that you've documented. But then there's also moving out into the psyche, into the mind, that depersonalization and dissociation starts to occur. So do you want to roll through a couple of those for people to perhaps have a checklist for?
Yeah, so just to give you some examples of what the research shows, and Dr. Michael Merzenich was really interesting on this subject. And for people who haven't read the book, Dr. Merzenich was kind enough to read every single word in the book and then dialogue with me about all of the science, because I'm not a neuroscientist and he's one of the world's leading neuroscientists. And, you know, I was nervous about the book. I didn't feel really comfortable as an academic, you know, talking about someone else's field. And, you know, I talk about medicine and I talk about psychology and psychiatry and neuroscience. And so I wanted a scientist who was willing to really do a deep dive into the work that I had done and kind of give me that check mark and say, yes, everything is accurate. I didn't want to give anything inaccurate to readers. And so Dr. Michael Merzenich, who's one of the busiest men on the planet, you know, he gets over 100 emails a day from all over the world asking him to do things, dropped everything, because he cares about kids in particular, and he cares about people, and he did a deep dive into the book. And he wrote a number of things to me, and one of the things he said that was, and I included them in the book, one of the most interesting things he told me was that when neuroscientists do research, they have to, in order to get a research grant and do the kind of work that they do that's so highly specialized, they might see a lot of changes in the brain, for example, but in order to do their study, they will have highlighted or isolated one component of the brain and then use that to say what happens in that one component of the brain when abuse has been happening. So I was looking at the work of Dr. Martin Teicher, and he's a leader in the field of abuse and what child abuse does to brains and what bullying does to brains. And it's pretty shocking and concerning and sobering how much all forms of abuse, including yelling, do, how much harm they do, how much damage. And in one of his studies, he focuses on the part of the brain called the corpus callosum. And the corpus callosum it's a sort of a tightly wound bundle of fibers that allows the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere to communicate with one another. So it's a very specialized part of the brain that has to be, you want it heavily myelinated or covered in this kind of insulating, it's a fatty insulating type substance that allows electrical signals to go much, much faster in the brain. And so, for example, if you wanted to if you wanted to really strengthen the part of your brain for music, and you were playing the violin and you were practicing every single day for an hour, when I looked at, if I was a neuroscientist and I looked at a brain scan of yours, I would see that the part of the brain that is involved in managing the left hand, for example, would be highly myelinated because you worked so hard, you're building up. That's why when you go to play the violin, you're all screechy and horrible at the beginning. But if you practice and you myelinate, you get more and more skilled and more beautiful sounds come out, and you default to it. You're able to just naturally, comfortably play this gorgeous instrument. Well, so that's myelination. Well, what happens in the brain when a child is being abused is it erodes, it disintegrates myelin, and specifically in the corpus callosum. And as Michael Merzenich said, he said, yeah, it does that kind of damage to the corpus callosum, but I can tell you it does damage all over the place in the brain. It's just that for the study, they had to focus on that one particular place in order to get scientific credibility. So that would be one example. Another example, I'll give you two more. In the work of Dr. John Rady, he talks about the hippocampus. And the hippocampus, the brain is all interrelated. You can't take components out. I mean, we have names, the scientists have names for them and so on, but the brain works as a network, all entwined, always working together. But just for the sake of being able to talk about it, the hippocampus would be a part of the brain that's understood to be very connected to emotion and to memory and to organizing memories and short-term and long-term. It's like a little kind of filing cabinet of the brain. It's the memory center and the learning center, among many other things. Well, if you look at a brain that's being abused over and over again, you'll see that the hippocampus is, as Dr. John Rady puts it, shriveled, completely shriveled up like a raisin, which is not how you want your learning center, your memory center to look in your brain at all. And then finally, I'll give you another third example would be there's a study done in Britain of prisoners. And this is the work of Dr. Daniel Reisel. And prisoners' brains who are murderers, they took a look, they did brain scans of them, and they found that their amygdala, which is a part of the brain that's involved in, it's called the alarm bells of the brain, or it's the threat response system of the brain. So the amygdala is completely enlarged in these people. Well, you can imagine the type of upbringing they had. You know, unless you're a sociopath, chances are good if you've ended up murdering someone, it's because you're in such a state of constant hypervigilance. You're like a ticking bomb ready to blow. Why? Because your brain is being incredibly damaged. It's so hypervigilant. It's so terrified of the next violence or harm or violation that's going to occur to you that it's become reactive. It's ready to attack. It's highly aggressive. That's the only way that it can possibly survive. And it makes a lot of sense. So, you know, we look at these tragic things that people do, and, you know, our hearts should go out to them, because chances are very good you're looking at a very damaged brain that has behaved this way, which means they probably suffered a massive amount of trauma as a child or a teenager. And it's just all really heartbreaking. And I just think as a society, we could do remarkable things if we started to think about these brain disorders from a medical point of view and not a moral point of view. And we started to rehabilitate brains that were identified or self-identified as traumatized.
Yeah, absolutely. So that brings to mind that we have, this is very oversimplifying a complex subject, but we have in ethics, we have a sort of a deontological ethic, which is the oughts and shoulds and you know, directives and stuff like that. And then we also have an ethics of compassion and empathy. And I think a lot of times when we react to an act of violence or a perpetrator doing some you know, heinous act, and it's not right, obviously, and it should be met with justice or whatever you want to call it. But we're coming at it from the deontological, very much a biblical kind of perspective, the oughts and the shoulds and thou shalts and all those kind of things. And that's okay in a sort of a spectrum kind of way, you know, that's one way to function. But I also think we need to weave in the ethics of compassion and mercy and understanding. And in bringing that on board, you know, when it's too late, it's too late. And there are people who are, what are they, unredeemable or whatever you want to call it. You know, the recidivism is, you know, they're just going to, but anyway, nonetheless, as you said, there's a history there, there's a story there that we need to see as a caveat. And how do we change this? How do we, other than just casting stones at them, what do we take away from this? And that is to, move into that ethics of compassion, and not to get them off the hook or forgive them or any of that, but just to understand that there is another child behind them, 10 years in age behind, who is going through that same creation process, and that where do we intervene, and how do we intervene to prevent the next person, the next incident from occurring. And so maybe that's a means by which society can take a broader view of how we react to these kind of things. And yes, he should not, or she should not have bludgeoned somebody to death or dismembered somebody or done all these horrible things. But nonetheless, we see that that person is not a monster. They're not morally deficient per se. It appears, it's prima facie, yes, it appears that way, but that there is a history there that needs to be examined, lest we repeat the mistake, lest we continue the cycle. So if there's any way of learning from these tragedies, and the United States is chock-a-block with these tragedies lately, and is to yes, we can throw our stones and we can say shame, shame, but nonetheless, we have to, I think, factor also when the passion dies down a little bit and reason starts to take over, is to say, what went wrong? Why did this? And I see that too. You get the hysterical media coverage of things, but also there are people who are saying, well, what created this monster? What happened? And that's like a first step, but there's many other steps that I guess, and that's what your book is about. How do we make those steps? How do we get from here to there? So, anyway.
Yeah, no, I really I worked on the book from a very individual point of view. How does the individual repair damage to the brain? How do they heal? What are the various steps you have to take? And so in a sense, the book is very personal because I suffered a certain sequence of traumas myself. And so I set myself the task. I was like, well, if I really believe this, and if I think this science is a worthwhile language that we should start to include in the way in which we talk about ourselves and the way we understand ourselves and our world, then I should be able to follow my own program and get better, right? And so that's exactly what I did. But what's fascinating to me is when you do that, you have to unpack the whole system, because the whole system is telling you to ignore your brain. And they're telling you that you're not smart enough to know anything about your brain. It's kind of like, I was thinking about this with the Bible. It's a little like, when the high priests controlled the Bible and its meaning because nobody understood Latin. But the second it was translated, people wanted those stories. They wanted to connect with the divine in their own way. They protested against the high priest controlling their relationship to God. And they took back those stories. And I think that that's really what we need to have happen with the brain. If I, with a PhD in comparative literature, can read the neuroscientific research enough, not to be a neuroscientist, but enough to understand what they're telling me about my own brain and what I can do to keep my brain healthy and resilient and flexible, then everyone can do it. And so when Dr. Michael Merzenich, after he read the book, he wrote me and he said, this is scientifically the most thorough treatment of the subject on planet Earth. And I thought to myself, I literally laughed, and I was like, that is such a sign of how necessity is the mother of invention. Right. Because I wrote that book as an angry mother. I was nothing but, if I was privileged enough to have the training to do a PhD, well, I'm going to take that knowledge, I'm going to take my skill at research, I'm going to take my ability to read very difficult things and difficult, confusing conclusions, and I'm going to weave them into something that's going to save other kids. And really, that's the passion behind the book, is the notion that as a teacher, as a parent, as an abuse victim, I want to know if I can get better and if I can get kids better. And the answer was a resounding yes.
Yes, absolutely. And you and I talked a little bit before we hit record, and you had mentioned that you have a PhD in comparative literature. And so for anybody out there who is thinking about buying the book and saying, well, Dr. Fraser is not a neuroscientist, I would say when you obtain a PhD, that you go through the crucible, you go through quite a trial of fire, and you have inquisitors, and you have, defending your PhD. It's a process, and I know nothing about it because I just have a high school education and a little bit of college, and that's it. But I've interviewed enough people who've gotten PhDs, and I respect the fact that it is not something that's a matchbook thing that's just handed out willy-nilly. And I had mentioned to Jennifer that Dr. Or Professor Leonard Molidnow had written a book called Subliminal. I can't remember, it's like 18 years ago or thereabouts. And he's a professor of physics, but he wrote a book on cognitive science and the odd nature of our brains and how we perceive things. And he very humbly admitted throughout the book that, hey, listen, I am not an expert in this, but I was motivated to write this book because I'm curious and I want to know. And so his motivation was different than Jennifer's, but nonetheless, he endeavored to open up this, literally these chapters of self-discovery about our minds and so forth. And I think it translates over to what you're doing. And your book is full of citation. Your book is full of reference, names that have people. So this is a great book for clinicians and therapists to use, keep on their shelf, because again, there's a resource there of these people who have done the heavy lifting with neuroscience and with psychology. And so you're to be lauded for that, you as an angry mother, you undertook this endeavor. And that was the sort of first stage of the rocket taking off, and that you were disciplined enough and careful enough to make sure that this book had integrity and it had rigor, and it's in there. People are welcome to challenge anything in there, but if you do it ethically and do it to where you're offering to the conversation. That's what dialectic and debate is about. And I'm not saying that people are going to challenge your book, but I know, and we'll get to this, that you've paid a cost for the production of this book and for your work that you've done related to this. And one other thing, while I'm on a roll here, is you mentioned earlier, it's like, how can we address physical ailments and issues, but not, again, the mind. And one thing that I like to think about in human behavior is, and it's not literal, this is a metaphor, is stigmergy, or the stigmergic process, which is similar to when all the schools of fish, they all shift at the same time, or the birds are out murmurating in the sky, and ants are stigmergists and they follow pheromone trails. But it is a decentralized collective, if you will, process of mind or consciousness, if you will, that everybody acts in a kind of flowing manner. And it's not organized, it's not pre-planned or discussed, but I think we are also stigmergic creatures in that sense, that there are these momentums or inertias socially and culturally that we're in the wave, and so like our dependence on fossil fuels is part of that. It's not a conspiracy. It's not the evil lords of the petroleum industry or the hydrocarbon fuel industry. It's just something we created, and we're in that wave and we're riding it, and we have to figure that out as mature thinking, high sentient creatures. So I'll just use that as an analogy to the same thing with the bullying epidemic and the bullying paradigm, is that we have to understand that we are in a wave. We are in a collective force and inertia that has to play itself out, but it's up to us to help with that deconstruction process, and recognizing that we are in this inertia of this kind of behavior, and that nobody should be called out. Nobody, as you said, nobody should be shamed for it. There are bad faith people there, because there are people that exploit this, and there are people who manipulate this, and authoritarian dictators are a good example of that. They know how to manipulate people. And we talk about the adult to child abuse. An authoritarian dictator, if you will, is the parent, and the people, the masses, if they're indoctrinated properly, are the children, and they revert to that sort of and you cover this very well in your book with the Stockholm syndrome, and it's the trauma bonding, and it is this kind of relationship that we have when we're vulnerable and we're susceptible, or we've been abused so much that we kind of lose our agency. So maybe we could crack into that, and because that's a huge thing. That's a thing in and of itself that we could have another interview on. But really, you touch on that as well, that we are so susceptible when we are injured, to falling into authority structures or to a dominance, almost like the narcissist codependent relationship. So I'll hush up and let you carry that one.
No, I know that is a huge, that actually is a theme throughout the whole book. And I really like that you use the word deconstruction, because my second book, I used Jacques Derrida's deconstructionist philosophy,
Okay.
because I was looking at children's grief, and I was looking at the relationship between the suppression of children's grief and World War. So the writers in the modernist era, like a whole series of them, they were very tuned into this in a completely amazing, fascinating way. And the reason I used deconstruction was because grief, by its very sort of sense, is something that you can't communicate. And the writers, we describe grief as, was a speechless with grief, or a lump in the throat, or these kinds of words that that come into play because it's such a hard, it's an inexpressible thing. It's so painful. I think it's Wordsworth who talks about too deep for tears, these feelings. And so with the Bullied Brain, I really drew on that deconstructionist way of thinking in the back of my mind, because really that is the approach of the book, is that you keep coming up against these entrenched systems, entrenched belief patterns that humanity has, and certainly in our world, our developed world, and trying to suggest otherwise, that maybe we need to look at it differently, makes people very angry, and it makes them resentful, and they don't want to hear, and they want you to be quiet, and they'll do anything to make you stop talking about it. It's really quite incredible. And so what I did was, and this is very much a comparative literature approach, is what we do in complet, we call it complet, that's different, is we don't specialize in a very narrow focus. If anything, we are always in an arena. So you pull different, and this sounds to me like you think this way and work this way, Justin. You think complet because you pull in different discourses from different areas and different languages and ways of thinking and specializations, and you put them together into the arena to see what happens. And when you do that, it oftentimes changes the conversation. So with the Bullied Brain, what I'm trying to do is change the conversation. And I'm trying to change it in such a way that people understand that all this energy we put into child bullying is really a red herring. I've said this in other interviews, but it would be like trying to change global warming or our dependence on fossil fuel by looking at child populations and how much gas consumption they have. Like, we're not gonna ever change anything by that focus. Well, the same thing with the bullying. If children are bullying one another, if it's an epidemic, if it's kind of absolutely out of control, and we've created the word bullycide now because there's such a correlation between high levels of suicide in our youth populations and bullying, harmful, cruel behaviors. Well, it's learned behavior. Children are not born bullies. They are born, and this is in neuroscientific research, wired for empathy. Empathy is the superpower of the brain. It's what keeps a child alive. A child from a very early age, like literally hours or days, a baby is aware of the powerful people in the room, and they're looking to see, in their very babyish way, but nonetheless, they will imitate, they will mimic, they will pay attention to faces, and they will start slowly but surely throughout all of childhood, paying close attention to the intentions and the feelings and the actions of powerful people. They study them because the adults in their world, they know, are the keys to their survival. So the brain is wired for empathy. Humans do not survive otherwise. And yet over the course of time, this is another example of turning gold to lead. And Dr. Vincent Felitti doesn't say this, but I think we can stretch what he's saying in very medical terms to neuroscientific terms and say, one of the things that happens is we erode children's natural empathic neural networks, and we replace them with bullying networks. And then we tell children not to do it and that they're bad. It's like, sorry, it's learned behavior. Look to the adults. If children are bullying, then we have a huge adult problem, which we know that we do. And it's so funny. We say about children, oh, we have zero tolerance for bullying. Well, how is that possible when the leaders in our world, the people with the most power, they've got the biggest platform, They are able to influence not only their own nation, but other nations in highly destructive ways, and even put the entire planet into jeopardy. Those people manifest bullying behaviors publicly without any kind of accountability for it in front of everyone, like in front of our children. So this cognitive dissonance between, there's one set of rules for children, they're not supposed to be cruel to one another, and there's another set of rules for adults who can be highly publicly manipulative, full of falsehood, incredibly bullying, incredibly damaging. And, I mean, we won't go any further than that, but we all know what we're talking about. And that's acceptable behavior. So how do we weigh these two things out? No wonder our children are suffering from such high levels of mental illness. That does not make sense to brains.
Yeah, and it again, it's steeped in tradition, in the sense that, you have this old aphorism, if you can call it that, a child should be seen and not heard, and that you are struck down, and it's all under the guise of discipline, but that you are struck down for your being a bit impertinent, or being a bit precocious, and that flame is snuffed. The imagination, the wonder, all these things that children possess, the gold that's running through them. I don't know what the motivation or impetus is on the adult so much, that maybe it's a veiled jealousy or something, that how dare you have this wonder and imagination and this carefree nature and all these different things. I almost wonder, it's nothing on the radar per se. It might be subliminal or subconscious, but how much of this, if brought into salience, if brought into the light, could alter these relationships and the affect of those relationships on the children. Is, again, I'm going back, I'm thinking of the Victorian era, and the stiff upper lip, and children are shipped off, and you mentioned this in your book, that shipped off to boarding school, and they're processed and programmed. There's no room for empathy, there's no room for what I like to think of as imagination and play and creativity and all these things. You're just to be very much focused on the tasks at hand, and austerity and all these different things. And how brutal is that? No wonder we're screwed up. And we're better, I think, in the 2022, whatever we are. I think that it is being approached differently. Obviously, I think children are being allowed to flourish more, and we are looking to them with different lenses to see the potential in them, because some people joke that we should learn from our children. We should learn how to behave through our children. And yes, some of it does need steering and guidance, but the imagination and the carefree and the wonder, and that precious time in their life when they realize that they are not the center of the universe, and the Lacanian stage where they become aware that there are other players and actors. But again, as you said, they're innately empathetic, and so they are, if they're not traumatized, they are in kindergarten or nursery school, they are exchanging these social tete-a-tetes with people, and having these conversations that we could learn from. This exchange, this process, again, if they're all reasonably functional and unaffected by by trauma and abuse. Anyway, I'm rambling, but that just seems like we can learn from them in ways that would be beneficial for us, or at least reawaken that in ourselves and remind us of the innocence of childhood. And I think there's a power to that. Because we can become so cynical and jaded as adults, even if we led a fairly leave it to beaver kind of life, and we didn't have major amounts of abuse or trauma, and I suspect there's very few of those folks, to revisit that stage of our lives where we were more open. And I can remember being 5 and 6 years old and running around. I went to the Waldorf system in the very beginning as a child, so Steiner's work, and we were taught to play, we were taught art, and we were given a little bit of mathematics just to whet our appetite for what would come down the line as our cortex was growing and developing, and we were maturing. They had I think it was a very interesting developmental system. Unfortunately, in the third grade, I got thrust into Catholic school, and they were kind of the other way around. It was a train wreck. I didn't know how to spell in the 3rd grade, and the kids in the 3rd grade at the Catholic school were reading books, and I couldn't even spell because I was just doing Waldorf stuff. So anyway, that's a side branch, but it's all in how we imprint these children. and let them imprint themselves to a degree, let them have some autonomy. Again, if they're in a healthy environment and their parents and their guardians and their extended family are nurturing them and taking care of them, I think that synergy can produce some beautiful results. And do you know, I mean, are there systems? I think you mentioned the Arrowhead for learning disabilities, but are there analogous systems where they are trying to teach this kind of combination of discipline and and standard education, but also teaching flourishing? Do you know of systems like that?
Well, I mean, there's just absolutely brilliant educators out there that are doing brilliant work. I mean, some of these schools that I read about, so Eton Aerosmith is one of them. It was designed by Barbara Aerosmith, and it is a whole way of thinking about cognitive strengthening, for example. So instead of, the old-fashioned model of school is that the teacher or the parent or the coach is kind of pouring knowledge into your head, and then you're going to have this knowledge, which is not how the brain operates. So the brain learns by making mistakes. And the brain learns and creates neural networks. It lays down, as we talked about before, myelinated neural networks. And this is how it gets really good at things. And this is why, children need practice and adults need practice at things for them to get good at it. Because the brain, it learns, at timed intervals and through repetition. So, we can never, we teach children things in a one-day workshop. Oh, here's how to drive safely and avoid car crashes. And here are the terrible statistics on how it's the leading cause of death in youth populations. And we're going to put you through a museum day or a special workshop day where you're going to learn how dangerous it is, and this is going to save you. Well, the brain doesn't work that way. So that's a pointless exercise. Children need to learn every single day how to drive safely and how dangerous it is when they're distracted, and how their mind will play a certain series of tricks on them. Like, it's a very risk-taking brain. It's a very reward-seeking brain. It's incredibly influenced by peers. These are the things they need to learn every single day if they don't want to die in a car crash, which is the leading cause of death in youth populations. The other thing that kids need to learn every single day, and this should be a part of every single school program, and I just pitched this idea, but nobody wants it, of course, just typical for my work. But I said we should be teaching workshops to kids pretty much every single day, starting early, on suicide. It's the second leading cause of death in youth populations. Yes, it's a very difficult topic, but you know what? Kids are sponges. They learn, and they need to learn all about their brains and how, if they have suicidal ideation, or they have depression, or they have anxiety, or these sorts of things, well, they need to start working in different ways with their brains, and of course with medical professionals and mental health professionals. Of course they need those people, but they also need to be empowered to understand that when they have these intense thoughts and feelings, when their world is colored in a particular way, they can also do a lot of things to change that. And it's medical. And like, if they had a cut or a broken arm, they wouldn't cover it up and not talk about it and not go and see a doctor. Well, why do they behave that way if they have suicidal ideation? They should be going to their parents and saying, you know what, I've got suicidal ideation. Yeah, we learned about it from kindergarten on. We've been learning about this. Right. And it manifests like this, and it gives you these impulses. And so I really need, a medical intervention here. I need a mental health professional, and I'm going to work with them and develop a brain plan, because there's clearly something off in my brain right now. And I got to get it better. It's just, to my mind, and I hate to use the pun, it's a no-brainer. Yeah. Why aren't we doing this? It's right. Incredible to me. It's like you and I talked about earlier, and I was sharing that I've just written an article on this subject, and hopefully my publicist will be able to place it somewhere. But people don't really want this information. They want to keep doing the same things over and over again, and just kind of putting their heads in the sand. But the reality is, from 2000 to 2018, youth suicide, that's 10-year-olds to 24-year-olds, has increased 57%. 57%. And to my mind, that is staggering. It's urgent. It should be on the front page of the New York Times. And with that article, that shocking statistic, there should be a whole scientific section on how we need to educate children about their brains, empower them how to maintain brain health, Tell them what to do when something goes wrong and what it feels like and what it looks like. Tell them how it can be seen on a brain scan. It's an organic thing, and how their brains can be brought back to organic health. Just like their bodies could if their bodies caught a virus and they were sick. Why are we not doing this? I just don't understand it. And I mean, this is me beating my drum of we've got to make change and it's got to happen now. But I really do feel strongly about it.
Yeah, and I want to keep going with this, and I want to get into some shadowy stuff here because I know you've paid a price for advocacy and awareness and casting a light into a room that's been shut. And before we hit record, we were talking kind of like, this is the family secret that nobody wants to talk about, but it's killing each generation of the family. And so let's keep going. And so in your advocacy and in your journey, and it's been a journey, as you said, you've dealt with abuse, your children have dealt with abuse, you've known people, you cite an example of a young woman in your book who went all the way with this, and I don't say that insensitively, but this poor person, there was no intervention, as you just spoke of, to prevent that tragedy. And so, yes, I can't even ask you a question about why there is this obtuse obstinance, this resistance to this. And the only thing I can come up with, and we've touched on this, is it's a kind of denial. It's a kind of, again, head in the sand, or it's just too much to take on. But it doesn't strike me as being that way if, especially if you experience a tragedy in your own life with a young person who may have attempted suicide, or may have attempted to harm, or even just cutting, or any of these things, that you would be motivated, just like you were, to just say, we have to think. And this is happening in the United States about the gun culture, and how do we, there's a fierce resistance to that. And God, I don't want to open up this can of worms, but it's like there's a conversation going on there that needs to happen. And I think it's the same thing with mental health as it relates to bullying, and as it relates to the destruction of children, is we have to talk about it. And so it's apples and oranges with guns and this kind of thing. But I think it's also very, it correlates well, because there is a built-in resistance that, and there's a power dynamic involved, and there's a lot of other things involved, but I also think there's a power dynamic involved with bullying and hierarchical structural of authority and power. So yeah, maybe they are more tightly correlated than I thought. But yeah, it has to start with this just admittance. And I'll say one more thing, and then I'll hand it back off to you. Heather McGhee wrote a book about called The Sum of Us, and she's a person of color, and she wrote a book about the zero-sum fallacy. Like, if I give this up, everything's going to come unraveled, And she wrote it about Black people in the United States seeking equality, and the fallacy of, if white folks in America give that equality to Blacks, that we're going to give up something, we're going to lose something, and we're going to, it's like the redistribution of wealth. And she's saying, no, basically this affects us all very positively, that there's a positive valence to this, that we will all benefit, all boats will rise, kind of thing. And so she takes that on in that book, and I think, what she's talking about in the zero-sum gain fallacy, that, if you give up something, you're giving up something, but you're not really giving up something. You're empowering someone else that will reciprocate with you. And I think maybe that is a door that can be opened, is to dismiss the myth of power, and also dismiss this zero-sum fallacy, that, if we change the way we discipline people, or as you said, break somebody down so that they can be more like the coach or more like the teacher, and they'll come out and there'll be this, Hollywood happy Disney kind of ending to it all, when that's just bullshit, it just, and you're welcome to swear too, it's just bullshit. So anyway, I'll hand it off to you now that I've had my tangent.
No, oh gosh, that just makes me want to say so many different things simultaneously. I completely agree with the argument that creating more equality is the answer. It really is. And I want to go back to something you said previously, where creating greater equality between children and adults and allowing children sometimes to be the teachers
Mhm.
would so remarkably improve our society. It wouldn't even be funny. And as you know from reading the book, the Lakota people have this idea and a word, their word for child is sacred being. And if we treated children that way, you know, and again, this is another Wordsworth line from his poetry, they come into this world trailing clouds of glory, and they are so utterly remarkable. And if we allowed them the same power as us, and we saw ourselves as their protectors, and allowed them to bring in more creativity and more imagination and more spirit from a timeless place or a dreaming place, and we harness that, and we try to just create an arena for them to grow and flourish and share with us their knowledge as well, while we give them our wisdom from having been longer on the planet. I mean, I know that sounds a little bit airy-fairy, but honestly, from a brain perspective, it's not. And then also, I mean, I think if we could just find the courage to admit to ourselves that we're a culture that has young people that kill themselves as their second leading cause of death. And that's a brain issue. That's a brain health issue. I actually have stopped using the phrase mental health because I think it leads people astray. I think when they hear the mental illness and mental health, they instantly go into a moral place, and they start to think about, you know, madness and lunacy and craziness, and they feel afraid. But that would be the same thing as being afraid of diabetes or afraid of a broken arm or afraid of a torn ACL. I mean, the brain is just an organic thing. It's like the lungs, it's like the heart, and it's not scary. It's just the absolute, as Dr. Michael Merznick calls it, that it's the captain of our ship. And not to pay attention to the captain of the ship or keep the captain healthy is crazy. That's what's crazy. So I think that that's one of our important things, is leveling the playing field. I mean, how primitive is it that we spend so, I'm going back to us being a visual culture. We actually make distinctions in the 21st century, really, between people who look different than each other. Like,
Yeah.
that's just so backwards that I honestly can't wrap my mind around it. And it's a really good example of how it's entrenched thinking. If you've been raised to believe something, it's like people that are raised in a particular religious tradition, they believe that it is the reality of the world from their point of view, and
Right.
that's fine. But it's a really good example of how, if you're raised to think a certain way or believe a certain system, it's pretty hard to walk away from that. And I mean, some people do, but lots of people will argue to the death that their version of reality, their version of the divine, their version of all of it is just, it's the only thing. And really, from a brain perspective, it's limited.
Yeah, yeah. And you know, a good example of that is the indoctrination in North Korea of children to accept you know, Kim Jong-un as the secular god, and you know that it all leads up to this deity, and that's the reality. And it's so, you know, to go back to the modernists and postmodernists, you know, I'm not a complete relativist when it comes to cultural or even moral relativism. I put it on a spectrum. Like, we can be absolutists and we can be relativists, but we have to have flexibility in that, and we have to acknowledge that there are times when we can flex towards relativism and say, yes, we all have cultural perspectives and we all have belief systems that we were brought up with and we imprinted on us, and but then there are some things that we should see as being foundational and universal. And I think the successful upbringing of children could fit down here. You know, we don't want to be relativistic, say, well, you know, 60% of the children, we're going to give them tough love and that good old, you know, boot camp discipline, and they're going to be great. They're going to, like, as you said in the book, they're going to be the next Charlie Parker, you know, or as the author, or the man who generated that film, Whiplash, sorry, I forgot his name, but
Damien Chazelle.
Okay, thank you. He references that, you know, that his teacher wanted to weed out all the non-hackers and get that one Charlie Parker, but doesn't sort of account for the wake that he leaves of bodies, who are ruined by his obsession, which is narcissistically driven. I mean, if you're there to create a Charlie Parker, then I think you're in it for the wrong reason. Same thing if you're there to create, and you referenced the Lakota people, and was it Jackson who was the coach, I believe, of
Phil Jackson,
one of the NBA teams, and his was more about cohesion and synergy and all these other beautiful things that the byproduct of that is, oh yeah, we won all these national championships. But don't worry about that. What we're here to do is to build people and use their talents. And so to touch back on one thing you had said, for those who might be, a little bit skeptical of all this, as you said, airy-fairy kind of thinking, is that you can still discipline a child. You can still rein them in. That's what parenting is, or that's what guardianship is to steer that child and forge them. So we're not, I know I probably speak for you when we're saying this is not without that that toughness that is also compassionate, but also, will have a positive outcome on the child. It will help them learn. And that's something you mentioned in the book that, when you wrote what was the book you wrote in 2015?
Bullies.
Yeah, and you were talking about people wanting to seek your counsel and also seek you for interviews, and they would always say, well, they would talk about, toughness and discipline and all these things. And so immediately when I read that, I thought, well, again, I put a lot of things on spectrum, put it on a spectrum. There is discipline, and then there is violence, and there is the degradation of the agent. But you can find discipline in a good way that will benefit. And you touch on that. You touch about children learning to embrace mistakes and learning to discover for themselves while you're there stewarding them. These things.
I think that one of the best ways for people to understand the human brain as it develops in children and what children need is to look at the 1-year-old. And this is the best example of the human brain in action because it hasn't yet gotten socialized. Actually, on that note, I want to just circle back quickly to something you said before, talking about socializing a brain or indoctrinating a brain. What's really interesting is when they look at the brains of people who are in cultures where they are forced to believe certain systems, they're supposed to worship, someone as a secular leader, or believe every word they say, even if it's shown obviously that they're lying. It's really amazing to me that this happens. Nonetheless, they can see anatomical differences in those people's brains. Those people's brains have become so rigid that they don't think anymore. They're lacking empathy. They're lacking critical thinking. They're lacking an ability to hold two different concepts simultaneously. These are complex things that the brain is designed to do. Well, they can't do that anymore because their brains have been so sculpted by this destructive, limiting framework that they're in. It's pretty tragic. That's a really good example of gold to lead for an entire populace. But going back to children, so a 1-year-old, speaking in general, a 1-year-old has not yet gotten indoctrinated or socialized into our education system or our parenting system. And that 1-year-old will so relentlessly pursue the goal of walking on 2 legs, which is it's an athletic feat beyond imagining. It makes all other athletic feats that people do in this world seem, not nearly as grand as going from a child that cannot walk at all to being a child that learns how to walk. And if you watch a 1-year-old and you don't interfere with them, they will do it. It doesn't matter how many times they fall. It doesn't matter how many times they hurt themselves. It doesn't matter how many times they tip over. It doesn't matter how frustrated they are. They will take everything in their environment in order to acquire this skill. Now that is intrinsic motivation. There's no adult yelling at them. There's no adult disciplining them for their mistakes. There's no adult shaming them for their mistakes. This kid is driven to learn. The human brain is hungry for learning all throughout the lifespan. It's us making our own decisions about not giving our brain what it needs to learn that makes it not fulfill its potential. So how is it possible that this intrinsically motivated child comes into the school system and every single mistake they make is highlighted to them? Everything. It's like, and throughout the entire school system, they're constantly told that they made a mistake, and they're graded on it, they're assessed on it, it's talked about. It's a ridiculous, outdated system. Kids are intrinsically motivated to learn. What we need to do as adults is create environments that allow them to develop their remarkable potential. And they now know in the early years, and the neuroscientists know, and Harvard is huge in this, early childhood education is all about play, because the brain learns by playing. And the brain is attracted to certain things at certain times, because we all have unique brains. I might be attracted to the water table when I'm 5 years old, and you might be way more interested in the book reading corner. That doesn't mean that I'm not going to learn how to read and you're never going to learn how to swim. It's just that our brains are different and we're attracted to certain things, and we learn in these very creative ways. So, you know, if you want a child to learn something, what you want to do is create the environment where it's safe. So you're not going to let your 1-year-old learn how to walk by a flight of stairs. You're not going to let your 1-year-old learn how to walk when there's a bunch of sharp objects around. You are going to create a safe environment. You're going to hold their hand. They're going to learn to trust that they can lean on you as they're learning this incredibly difficult skill. You're going to stand by and dry their tears when they're frustrated. That's what you're doing when you're parenting. I mean, really, that's what you're doing. And if your child makes a serious mistake, that's you sitting down going, okay, how did it happen? How can we stop it happening again? What did you need from me that I failed to supply? I mean, it's what we need to do. You can watch animals in the wild playing with their children, teaching them skills they need to learn, like fighting, like running, like hunting. I mean, this is what we need to do as human creatures. You know, it's not, you know, as one of my things I like to say is, it's neuroscience. It's not this kind of, you know, impossible world of arcane knowledge. It's not. It's neuroscience. It's the science of the brain. It's okay. We can learn about our brains.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I know I keep going back to primitive cultures, if we can call them primitive cultures, but they're so advanced. And it's just like a child. What can we learn from what we were doing, say 10,000 years and back, you know, but before we, and even the argument of settlement and agriculture is up for grabs in paleoanthropology. I mean, they were just like the water table in the book, you know, various regions, various cultures, they all kind of settled in at different times. But what can we learn from a more cohesive and more structured society? We're a very fractured society right now. You know, even the glue of the internet and the social media is not it's a panacea for connectedness. It's not connectedness as we may best benefit from. And so I always look back to the past, and there's the criticism of anarcho-primitivism, which says, you know, we need to, you know, criticize all the modernity and all these kind of things. And I say, well, yeah, okay, that's fine. But part of, I think, that criticism is to say that we really had some things switched on in the past, and let's bring them forward. And so I think that maps onto how we can look at children as well, to say, you know, what did our ancestors do to produce productive members of not only a tribe, but, you know, when tribes got together and there was, you know, sort of ethno groups and things like that flourished and got along. And yeah, there was friction and there was fighting and things like that, but that's also in our nature. I mean, we're not that far removed from primates, so we like to tussle and things like that. But overall, I think everybody was just more cooperative and more structured to benefit the group versus the individuality that is so prized in our culture right now. And so we can learn from the past, and we can learn from children as well. So I'm trying to draw a parallel there that hopefully holds up. Yeah, we can learn from our past. And here it is. It's the ontogenetics, like the evolution of an individual. So you and I are at a stage of ontogenetics where at a certain age, and you know, we've passed through multiple stages of adolescence, early adulthood, and childhood. But man, go back and watch and observe the wisdom in the earlier periods of life. Maybe not so much the teenage years, but they have things to teach too, but certainly the young ones, right?
Well, no, I mean, teenagers, the thing about teenagers is they're so creative. Yeah. It's one of the most, and they also are like incredibly fast learners. They learn so fast at speeds that we don't have anymore as adults. So they're super creative. I love how they're intellectual risk takers as well. They're physical risk takers, which isn't great because we're trying to keep. That's probably
what I was alluding. I was a raucous teenager. So.
No,
anyway, I know what you're saying. Yeah, no, go ahead. I'm
Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
vibing on what you're saying about the teenagers. I was just having a laugh at my expense. I'm not a poster child for good teenage behavior, or I wasn't, I should say.
No.
But yeah, you're right. You're absolutely right. They're switched on, and they've gone from that early absorption period to now I've got these tools and these assets, and how do I express them? And it's very frenetic, as you know, as we all know. Yeah, which is a great tool to learn from, or with rather.
What's so fascinating is that the teenage brain, unbeknownst to them, because we don't teach children anything about their brains, or adults in general, which is one of the strangest things in our society. But teenagers are actually going through a brain changing process, which drives them to do things that aren't conscious. So they are driven out of the family cave, like to go back and use some of the, during evolution, this would be the key time for a young person to find a mate. And so they're driven by curiosity, they're driven by exploration and adventuring to leave the family cave, which is a terrifying thing to do. If you think back in the day, going out on the Serengeti away from the family home, the cave and the fire and the parents and the known tribe, but your body and your brain are driving you to do it. So our kids, the brain doesn't know about vehicles. It doesn't understand cars. So this is why children and cars put together during this brain time is very, very dangerous. And it results in tragic results because we don't train them how to, I actually have designed a course on this, which of course people aren't interested in. I tried to get it to like driving companies. I tried to get it to insurance companies. I tried to get it to the government. I tried to get it to the Center for Disease Control, because the highest level of death in our youth populations is driving. And it's an online program that teaches kids all about the adolescent brain so that they know how to drive safely. And so it's literally using techniques like mindfulness. Before you turn the key in the ignition, your brain is going to trip you up. And so I argue with them that every time you get in the car, you have to put your mind in the driver's seat. Your brain is only the engine. Let your brain drive the car. That's great. But your mind has to be in the driver's seat or you're going to get into an accident. You're going to hurt someone. You're going to hurt yourself. You're going to go to jail. It's high stakes. You got to learn how to control and manage and work with this adolescent brain, this gifted, amazing brain of yours, but it's going to trip you up. We know that for a fact. And so we have to do this. And I put it into an online course because I wanted people to be able to, kids, to go back to it every single day. The brain doesn't learn by one single course on a Monday. It has to be repeated over and over and over again. It's like mindfulness practice. It's like exercise. It's a discipline. You have to do it to reap the results. And I mean, this is the underpinning argument of the bullied brain. That's how the brain is too. If you want to heal your scars, if you want to restore your health, it's hard work. You have to put in daily practice to these evidence-based behaviors and practices that obviously I go into in the book in order to have the high-performing, healthy, resilient brain that we all should want to have. But yeah, no, there is much to be done. And yeah, it's great to have this conversation. It's such a pleasure to talk to a like-minded person for me, because I oftentimes am like hitting my head against the wall because like you said, people don't want to hear this. They're quite afraid. Somehow neuroscience is intimidating to everyone. They've been trained not to think all their lives about their brain, to act like it is not something that they can work with and they're not empowered to connect with. So it's an uphill struggle.
Yeah, absolutely. And equally uphill is, I think, again, in the West, and we'll say the Western Hemisphere, we keep smashing into walls. We keep literally hitting our heads on the walls with, being stressed out and dissatisfied with life and chasing ephemeral euphoria or, hedonistic pursuits that, again, they may give you a little dopamine shot, but one thing I'm fixated on in what I'm trying to, my nascent work that I'm trying to do is to get folks to understand that, peaks and troughs are, part of what we are, but also that there is this space for a combination of resilience and equanimity or calmness and serenity. And it goes back to the Eastern wisdom traditions of just centering yourself. And you touch on mindfulness and work with it quite a bit in the book, especially moving towards the end. is to get to that place where we can be mindful while we're not being mindful. We can be mindful in waking state and moving through the day. And you touch on caricatures of ourselves, and can we strip the persona away, the character we play in life, and not necessarily go to pure authenticity, but dance with that caricature and dance with the persona and learn to recognize when the persona is acting and when you are not being authentic. So there's so many myriad of facets and things that can be done to help us at least just recognize where the dissatisfaction is coming from, and perhaps, and you, I believe, were in faculty at U Toronto, right? And so John Vervaeke's there, and he's one of these guys. I don't know if you've seen his work, but he talks about this meaning crisis, and he's a CogSci guy. So he's got the 4E CogSci system going, and he raps with a lot of guys that are, very adept at this lingo of self-improvement, but recognizing, just like you did in your book with neuroscience, like what are the mechanics of this? What are the nuts and bolts of how we are improving ourselves? And he interstices Buddhism and Neoplatonism, and again, CogSci, and a nod to biblical wisdom and all these things. He's from a religious family, and he's kind of left that. But guys like that are trying to explore ideas like meaning and sense making and things of that nature. And your book fits well within that as a necessary intervention. As we would say in medical terms, if a patient presents, then you come up with the intervention if it's trauma, or if it's not critical, then you work with modalities and therapies that can assist. But I think yours is an intervention for a trauma. If someone comes in with a car crash and they've got multiple traumas to the body, I think you're doing that kind of work. And because as you've said, and I completely support you in this, that the brain, and you mentioned Cartesian dualism, the brain is the system. We are not separate from it. Our mind and our brain and our body are a unitary system. We have to acknowledge that. And we cannot divide those and bracket those things out. And that's another critical aspect of your work, I think, is to remind people of that we are a holistic system, that everything, it's like an engine. Everything has to be firing well and coordinating well for you to get down the road.
That's it goes back to something you said at the very beginning, where you were talking about this holistic idea. And it's one of the things that I work on now in my own mindfulness practice. I very specifically work on dialoguing, or as you put it, kind of beautifully, dancing with my mind, my brain, and my body. So what I'm trying to do is make sure that the three things are not at cross purposes. They're actually in harmony. And that's a bit of it's hard work. It's not something that we are naturally trained to do. Just as you were describing our culture, how we're pulled in these different ways and we're seeking gratification, and we have tons of trauma and we don't know it. It's all kinds of invisible neurological scars, and our culture doesn't talk about it. So we don't know to go and get help from professionals and all these sorts of things. But in mindfulness, if you can take time throughout the day or for an allotted time in the morning or something, where you actually become aware of your brain and what your brain is doing, or how it's feeling, or what it needs, or what it's thinking, or how it is corresponding with your mind, corresponding with your body, just taking that moment of awareness, like shine a light or take a telescope. I like to use that analogy because neuroscientists, whenever they talk about neurons, which are our brain cells, and they want to talk about how many we have, the only analogy they can use for how many brain cells we have, which is anywhere between sort of 86 and 100 billion. That's what we all have in our heads. Can you imagine? 86 to 100 billion neurons. And the only thing that's comparable for a neuroscientist to give a sense of that is the stars in the galaxy. So I love the idea that we have a galaxy within our heads, and we need to pull out the telescope a lot more and take a look at the incredible constellations and the beauty and the illumination, to use your word, of what's inside of us. It's so remarkable. And to recognize that in other people. Every single day you look at social media and they talk about the sculpting of women's, I don't ever hear them talk about men, but the sculpting of women's bodies. They have sculpted legs. Oh, she's 40 and she has a sculpted abdomen. And it's like, That's great. Like, I'm so glad they're fit. I'm so glad. Let's start talking about sculpted brains. There
Mhm.
should be part of our culture where we say we want to be equal with all the sculpted brains. We don't need to worry as much about their legs and abdomen. What's really going to bring us fulfillment and care for the planet and health and well-being and, equity is this idea of honoring one another's brains and seeing them as these remarkable galaxies. And
Mhm.
that's one of the big changes that I hope my book is able to at least start a conversation on it. And, it's funny when you talk about University of Toronto, that's where I did my PhD. And after I finished my PhD, they asked me to come and lecture. So I wasn't part of the faculty, but I worked at I
Okay.
lectured for years in the literary studies program. And
Okay.
so I lectured on biblical studies. I lectured on the Odyssey and the Iliad and Dante's. I designed a course that was on of all things, Finnegan's Wake, James Joyce's
Mhm.
Finnegan's Wake, and Dante's Divine Comedy for third-year students. And I was such a young professor at the time, it never occurred to me that this was a ridiculous thing to do. I just thought that they'd be so interested. It's just I love University of Toronto.
Mm, that's awesome. That's awesome. Yeah, and you were idealistic, and you had a passion, and you were conveying that, and you had the opportunity to convey that to a I don't want to say captive audience, but an audience that's there to learn, right? And they're
Yeah,
paying to learn, so they're willingly captivating themselves, and you're
yeah.
captivating them with the work of the masters of some of the great literary powers of our time. So yeah, that's that teaching. You know, talk about a undervalued, underappreciated profession is, whether it's teaching kindergartners or all the way up to, postdoc or PhD level teaching. It's just, that is something that should be held as highly and as esteemed as these, again, captains of industry and business folks that, we tend to, we have our Elon Musks and our, what are they, the Bill Gates and all these guys that, they just get all this attention, and it's like, yeah, they're good and they're talented and they have good ideas, but there's billions of us, and a lot of us, those are like lottery winners. They get that relevance that I think is, we could shine relevant lights on people doing much less glamorous things, not shooting themselves into space with rocket ships, but sitting in front of a room full of 20-year-olds and switching on lights and things like that. I think that's much more impressive than yeah, whatever it is that who's the Amazon guy, I've forgotten his name, but these
Oh
guys,
yeah.
anyway, whatever. Yeah, these guys that are just like, come on.
I know I must admit the rocket ship business for me was like, oof.
It just speaks volumes for where we are in terms
Oh,
of priorities, right? And I'm okay, it's criticism, but it's not, like capital C criticism. It's just how we are. It's just what we do. And just like in your book, there's no judgment. It's empathy based all the way, and you walk the walk with empathy, because you don't just sit and demonize these folks that are narcissists or dark vulnerable triads or tetrads, all these monsters. They need to be identified, and they need to be held accountable, but nonetheless there needs to be compassion built back into that. And I admire the fact that you present in that manner, that this is a global matter. This is a matter of a lot of facets, I guess is a good way to say it. And anyway, I think we've reached a really good spot. Do you have anything else that you want to share with the audience in terms of having hope, having a sense of there being a way to navigate from an existential crisis to at least some baseline of flourishing or resilience or recovery? Do you want to part with that and just, and because I'm sure there are some going to be people watching this who are maybe in crisis mode or maybe in a critical mode. And so let's maybe finish on a high note and send it out with a way to offer some hope for folks that are struggling.
well, the absolute key to the whole book is the subtitle. And the reason the book is called The Bullied Brain is because we tend to want to skip the difficult part. But if we skip the difficult part, we're not motivated and we don't really believe we can make change. So Unfortunately, you have to walk through some of the difficult pieces of the book to get to the evidence-based practices for repair and recovery. So the Bullied Brain, heal your scars and restore your health. The one takeaway and the way to end this is to remind everybody that, like your body is so remarkable at healing, you can be torn to shreds. You can have a broken bone. Your body, with the right interventions, with evidence-based, science-grounded practices, heals. So does your brain. So if you have neurological scars in your brain from bullying and abuse, if you have neural networks that don't serve you anymore, they might have kept you alive. They might have kept an aggressive world at bay. They might have stopped further shame and humiliation coming your way. You can change that. The brain has limited cortical real estate, which means that if you work really hard and you change your hypervigilance into mindfulness and calm, because you in fact are safe now, you've created a different world and a healthy environment around yourself, and you don't have to pour all your energy into keeping yourself safe from a malevolent world, that's amazing, and you can do it. The most amazing part of the brain is that it's neuroplastic. You can change your brain by what you practice. You can change your brain by the environment that you put it in. If you repeatedly put yourself into a toxic environment, it hurts your brain. So you need to exit. You need to exit the bullying and abuse paradigm. There's no place for it in society. It doesn't do anything for you. It doesn't create anything. All it does is destroy and harm and damage. And the more we, each individual, get ourselves healthy, the more we bring health into the world and health to other people and healing relationships. And that's all any of us can do. And so really, the book, although it's a bit tough, it's the most empowering thing in the world to learn about just how adept your brain is at recovery.
And the book is a resource center. It is a means by which you can continue to discover through, I'll read a book cover to cover, and then sometimes I just go in and I hit a chapter and I refresh. And I think this book does both of those things. You can just take little bits and work with it. And again, there's citation, there's reference, there are names of people, so you can expand beyond the book to find help and healing and therapy and put yourself on a path to improve your personhood, your agency, your mind, your body, spirit. I define spirit as being part of the psyche. So when we are at our best and we are flourishing, that's high spirit for me. So Dr. Fraser, I just want to, if you've taken some hits from being an advocate and standing out, I want to loud some kindness to you and say thank you and acknowledge you for this. And I hope I'm starting something, put a little snowball on the top of a hill, and other people will start to connect with you. And I've seen interviews that you've done. There are other supportive folks out there, and I think I just want to see it catch on. I talked about stigmergy earlier. I want to see the shift of the stigmergy to where this is snowballing and this is creating gravity and momentum, and going from a bullying paradigm to an empathy paradigm. So again, let me thank you for your work and your effort and your courage in putting this together and publishing it and having faith in yourself and faith in the work and the concepts that are there in the work. Can you speak to what is in the near future for you, and maybe leave us with something that you would love to imagine, like the Disney people, they say Imagineering. What would you love to Imagineer into reality?
Oh boy, what would I like to Imagineer? I would like, exactly as you say, I would love this book to create momentum. I would love it to create a conversation that shifts us from really entrenched ways of thinking that obviously aren't serving us at all anymore. It's not serving our kids, and getting people excited about this whole new world that is this galaxy in our heads. Like, let's start talking about that. Let's start learning. Let's start turning to the people of like Dr. Michael Merzenich, this incredibly brilliant man with his understanding of our brains. It should be our school system, our universities, our workplaces, we should be steeped in brain knowledge. You know, in the same way that in the 1980s, workplaces understood that if their employees were physically fit, they'd have less sick days, they'd be way more high performing, way more productive, way nicer to each other. They wouldn't suffer nearly as much stress. Well, I'm excited. What I want to imagineer is workplaces where everybody's got the brain gym. They go to the brain gym at lunchtime and they talk with each other and they see one another's brains and they do brain exercises and they celebrate this gift that has been given to us, that resides invisibly in our skull, but is as remarkable as anything else on the planet. Just a matter of discovery, really.
That's beautiful engineering, imagineering. I'm glad I asked that question because I think, again, I want to see this out on a high note. And so let's consider ourselves allies and sharing a vision for, again, I came to be motivated to do what I'm doing, to leave this world knowing that I did something, I tried, and that it's not for vainglory, it's not for me. I love the Buddhist concept of the no self. So I do have an ego and I do have a personality, but none of that really is important, especially when we are in these larger global existential precarious positions with nuclear annihilation and global warming and children who are being poisoned mentally and not being afforded the opportunity to be their best potential. So I'm willing to dedicate the rest of my life in whatever way I can to throw my hat into the ring and help. And I know you've done that and you've done it courageously. And again, I acknowledge you for that. And I see others joining in the ranks of doing that. Not just you, but everybody who's committed to this kind of project. The second Enlightenment project, the enlightenment of the interiority. You know, we did the Enlightenment project where we sort of improved our standard of living and brought through medicine and industry, we elevated life for a lot of people. I say we as one facet, one segment of humanity, but wouldn't it be nice to see an Enlightenment 2.0 where we learn and relearn how to be sentient and civilized and compassionate and above all empathetic, so that we are connected in that way. That because you use a lot of metaphors about roots and trees and branches. And one thing I thought of when I read that, and you had referenced it multiple times, is that there is this web underneath in the earth that connects the trees, and it is a mycorrhizal web. And so I would, using metaphor magic, I would say that is the sort of the unconscious, to get Jung in for a second. It is this fabric of thought, this fabric of mind that we share. And there's nothing mystical or supernatural about it. It's just, you know, we pass ideas along back and forth to each other, good, bad, or indifferent. And we have the power to pass good back and forth through our mycorrhizal networks, that is memetics and communication and things like that. So and you've done an excellent job in your own way to contribute to that. So I hope this book just grows legs and starts running and has a great life. I really want to see that. I've interviewed people with books before and they've all been very inspiring, but this one is critical. You know, this one is, let's get it to the front of the line. You know, and I mean that with sincerity, because without being gloomy, I'm concerned for humanity. And I think this is one way to check in and see to our health and to see to our well-being. So Dr. Fraser, it's been a wonderful conversation. To those of you on YouTube, thank you so much for staying with us this long. I always say that to folks if we've gotten over an hour and a half or so. Thank you so much for your staying with us and listening, and hopefully this was beneficial to you. As I mentioned in the introduction, all relevant information for Jennifer will be down below in the description field. And you can discover her book, you can discover her social media there, and her website as well. So I will say goodbye to you when we stop record. And again, I thank you so much for joining me for a conversation and a dialogue. And I very much appreciate that.
It was really very illuminating for me as well. I learned a lot. And like I said, I find these conversations important like you do. I feel urgency around them, as you know, and you do too. And I think that's okay. And I hope your listeners do too. I think we have an opportunity here.
Yes. Amen. Amen. Let's stop on that. And again, YouTube viewers, thank you as well for your participation in this. And I hope your trajectory shifts for the better in experiencing this conversation. So goodbye to you all. And again, Dr. Fraser, I'll say goodbye to you after we stop recording.